Hi everyone, my name's Kevin Miller and I'm the website team lead for the COVID tracking project. So on March 7th, 2020, which to many of you probably seems like a decade ago, the COVID tracking project was born, and it was really started as a scramble by a number of journalists and friends to just get data from states in terms of how many tests they're reporting, um, and the impact of the virus, and put it into a simple spreadsheet. So to begin with, the COVID tracking website was literally just a button to that spreadsheet. Um, and that was really because we thought that the project would only last a few weeks, that of course the federal government would step up and do the kind of data collection that we were doing manually. Um, but that ended up not being the case. Fast forward a year later, we've had over 100 million visitors. We've delivered 66 terabytes of API traffic. Um, we see our API as an additional way to broaden the reach of our project, and so we're very excited to see that level of use. We've been cited in everything from daily news broadcasts and local markets to um, large market print publications. We've also been used by a number of state and federal government agencies to determine policy. And interestingly, the Biden administration transition team working on COVID cited our work a lot and directly said that they use COVID tracking as their source of data for what was going on during the pandemic. So really, the COVID tracking project became a critical piece of infrastructure during a crisis, um, by accident, with a small team of full-time people who eventually became full-time, and only one and a half full-time web developers. Um, we did have, or have had over the course of the project, over 100 people volunteer on the website, either in development or design. But given how important the COVID tracking project is, um, we don't have the resources or people to really devote to things like operations. And so very early on, we decided that something like a static site generator would be critical to the operation of our website, because it's really difficult to get volunteers to do operations and support, and we had not that many people who we could dedicate to something like that. So having a website about a unfolding emergency means you're constantly responding to things outside of your control. You can't really plan for what the website is going to need to do in the next week or month, and so you really need to have a platform that is flexible and can respond to a lot of very quickly shifting needs. You also need fast turnaround, and so that's where something like deploy builds in somewhere like Netlify or Gatsby Cloud is really important, because you need to be able to show continually developing work really quickly to stakeholders. And the operations and scaling of infrastructure are distractions. So those are things that are not critical business functions on the website. They're just really difficult day-to-day things to keep running. And if you can minimize your time spent on ops, that really helps you dedicate a limited number of development resources to something that's really important. So in the early days of the website, we really focused on the build as like the final step in data quality assurance. So because we're collecting data from 57 different states and territories, putting it into Google spreadsheets, those spreadsheets were initially going through a very slim publishing process. It meant that bugs would come up all the time. People would type in a special character or screw up the way the Google Sheets likes to format numbers into dates. And so the build process was really the last step in quality control. And for a lot of people, they were really new to the idea of a website where there's a temporal shift between doing something and it being live. They're used to maybe in a institution that has a more quote unquote traditional CMS that publishes immediately. And so we really needed to acculturate people to the idea of our build process, especially because we were working with so many different sources of data, and each one of those could trigger a site build because we were pulling data from so many different places. What we ended up doing was elevating the build to something that people talked about in the culture. So, for example, we had several Slack channels that were just hooked up to Netlify using Zapier, where people could trigger a build manually, and we really, and then we would post build status in Slack so people could see really real time what was going on, and any build failures went to a wide variety of stakeholders, and that really kept people in the loop about what was happening on the website, especially as the site grew larger. Even conditional page building wouldn't prevent us from having a build that was over 10 minutes. And so acculturating people to the idea of the build was actually very helpful to catch problems that maybe went through our entire QA process. So our website pulled content and data from a number of sources. As I said before, we started as a Google Sheet. Google Sheets are still the way that our hundreds of volunteers, enter data. We used to pull data straight from Sheets, but there's a lot of problems with that. So now we pull it through our own internal API process. We also get content from Contentful. We use BigQuery in other places where we're pulling data from Google Sheets, especially because BigQuery allows you to do things like enforce typing on columns. We also use Mapbox for some really big map projects and then pull those layers into Gatsby. And we use Airtable bases for a whole variety of other bits and pieces. And so the great thing is that a lot of these have source plugins, but we found that in a few months of the project really growing, especially as states added more data sets, was that the data fetching process was killing us in terms of both build and also developer time. So because we had so many developers, with the exception of Contentful, we couldn't just give all these people API keys. So what we ended up doing was instead creating just Git repositories that had flat JSON files put in them. And then our website would just clone those repos in order to get all of the data from states and all the data for our disparate other data sets. The nice thing about that is it means developers can just easily get set up by running, yarn setup, and that clones all the files in the right place. It also means that all of that data gets full revision history, and it lets us make snapshots of the website at different points in time. So we had a number of repositories like website data, which are all public, have these really large JSON files in them, and these files are just generated using GitHub Actions. So even though this isn't really the Gatsby way, quote unquote, in terms of we could get this data out of Airtable and Contentful and all these other sources, because we're so large and we have so many volunteers, we couldn't just share all of these API keys with people. This allowed us to continue to develop really quickly without having to manage things like access control. Another thing that was really close to our heart at the project is ensuring that everyone has access to the data regardless of their technology or abilities. That meant our website looks very different than a lot of other COVID tracking like websites. Um, for one, you'll find that we don't use the United States map as a critical piece of navigation. And that's really because there's a lot of problems with the map of the US. First, if I'm let's say, a sighted user who still has access to a pointer like a mouse, the US map is not evenly distributed. So as you get west, a lot of states get smaller and the click targets become really difficult to find, especially something like Delaware or Rhode Island. And if I have a motor skill issue, like it's difficult for me to point to finite areas, that becomes really challenging for me to pick out Rhode Island in order to get the information about Rhode Island. Let alone, most of these interfaces are not accessible by keyboard at all. So these interfaces, while they might look interesting, are really not useful to people who need alternative ways of getting to the data. A visualization tool we really adopted very early on in the project was D3 and its SVG libraries, mostly because it meant that we could pre-render all of our visualizations, and even if a user doesn't have JavaScript, they'll still get access to them. But the other great thing about SVGs is they're clickable elements that can get things like events. So in all of our interfaces, like this hex map, first of all, you'll notice it's a hex map, so it's easy. Every state's the same size. Rhode Island is the same size as Texas, so it's easy to click on them. But we also support the keyboard to navigate the map using the arrow keys. And this mobile interface is also available to screen reader users on the desktop and mobile side. And since this is actually just an unordered list, it's easy for them to tab through the list of states. We also had full keyboard navigation of all of our charts. And all of our charts come with not only a table of the real data in the chart, but a off-screen, but still readable by screen readers, description of the chart that's generated automatically that tells them what was the most current value, what was the most recent highest value, so that people can get an idea, even if they can't perceive the chart, of the direction that the chart has. The other great thing about a static site, besides its performance and stability, is the fact that they're easily archivable. And as a project that is temporary and also is of great interest to people like researchers and archivists, we want to ensure that not only our main site is accessible to people in 10 years, regardless of changes in technology, but also that our internal documents and large repositories of source information are available as well. So for example, we take daily screenshots of the multiple COVID websites for every state and put those into a repository and build them in a interface using Gatsby so that every screenshot that we take is both available to our own researchers, but also we just to make this available to future archivists, it's literally just copying a folder of a ton of screenshots. We also are working on converting some of our Slack conversations and channels into snapshotted Gatsby sites that can be scrubbed of personal information. But again, it's static HTML files so future researchers can look at how we work as an organization and also how we came to certain decisions about how we collect data or structure things, etc.